318 million people are going hungry right now, in 2026. Global wheat production just broke records. Rice reserves are at all-time highs. Argentina harvested 27.8 million tons of wheat, more than any year in the country's history, and the EU and Canada pulled in bumper crops right alongside them. So where is all that food going? None of that matters, because people in Sudan, in Gaza, in Somalia, in Haiti are starving to death, while the world's grain silos sit full. The food exists. The problem is that the system moving it from farm to plate is collapsing, and the trigger pulling it apart is not a war or a recession. It is a temperature shift in the Pacific Ocean that most people have never heard of. The engine of destruction, El Niño, La Niña, and why oceans dictate harvests. A pattern called ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, controls more of the world's food supply than any government, any corporation, or any trade deal. When the Pacific swings warm, you get El Niño, and when it swings cool, La Niña takes over. Each phase rewires rainfall and temperature across entire continents, which means the yields of the world's breadbaskets rise and fall on what the ocean decides to do. Indonesia sits right in the middle of this oscillation. Straddling the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the archipelago absorbs every swing, and its modern history reads like a damage report from those swings. A severe El Niño struck in 1997, arriving at the exact same moment as the Asian financial crisis. Drought forced the country to bring in more than 5 million tons of imported rice, draining foreign exchange reserves right as the rupiah cratered. Fires consumed 9.7 million hectares of forest. Government scientists understood the ENSO anomaly, but the bureaucratic system had no way to turn that data into action before the damage spread. By 2015, a different weak point cracked open: irrigation. Satellite data from the Standardized Precipitation Index exposed the shift. During a normal year like 2013, severe drought covered a negligible 0.06% of Indonesia's rice fields. Once the 2015 El Niño arrived, moderate drought expanded by 17,333 square kilometers, severe drought by 20,324 square kilometers, and extreme drought swallowed another 5,134 square kilometers on top of that. Pololo district in central Sulawesi watched its irrigation discharge fall from a historical average of 2,904 millimeters to just 808, which meant the crops received only 28% of the water they needed to survive. The 2023 event brought the highest ambient temperatures the Indonesian archipelago had ever recorded. Extreme drought scorched 870,000 hectares of farmland and destroyed 1.2 million tons of rice, according to the Ministry of Agriculture. And this is where the compounding becomes visible, because econometric research now shows that the accumulated weight of El Niño events has carved a structural 13% loss out of Indonesia's GDP per capita by 2023, measured against a scenario where those disruptions never happened. Who pays the price? The unequal burden of climate shocks. Climate shocks land on the people least equipped to absorb them, and in Indonesia, that concentration runs deep. Smallholder farmers take the first hit. An average small farm earns only 49% of its income from agriculture, which means a delayed monsoon wipes out both their food and their cash at the same time. Over in East Nusa Tenggara, dry seasons stretch up to 9 months, and without resilient irrigation, total crop failure is not a risk. It is the default outcome. Landless laborers sit one step lower. Climate shocks shrink plantation output, daily wage jobs disappear, and with no savings and no collateral, income drops to nothing. That drop converts directly into acute household food insecurity. Millions of urban poor face a different kind of blow, one that hits through prices. Urban poverty stood at 7.09% in 2024, and those households spend more than half their income on food. Econometric data puts the food demand elasticity of the poorest 20% at negative 0.010, which is effectively zero. When rice prices climb 10 to 15%, these families do not switch to something cheaper because nothing cheaper exists. They eat less. Children take the damage that never reverses. As of 2024, 46% of Indonesian children under 5 roughly 10.7 million kids, live in moderate or severe food poverty and lack the minimum dietary diversity needed to develop normally. Monsoon delays caused by climate shocks have been tied directly to lower weight measurements in children under 2. Early childhood nutritional deprivation causes lifelong cognitive and physical stunting. Mothers carry the weight that rarely gets measured. Representing 39.4% of the informal workforce, women reduce their own caloric intake to keep their children fed during a crisis, liquidate what small productive assets they own, and take on exploitative labor. On top of all that, climate disruptions force them to walk further for water and work longer hours, pulling time away from child feeding and compounding the nutritional damage across generations. The price machine: how a drought in Java starves Papua. Indonesia's archipelago creates naturally fragmented supply chains, and that fragmentation turns every crop failure into a price wildfire. Modeling of wholesale to retail transmission shows a clear asymmetry. When producer prices climb, consumer prices follow immediately. But when producer prices fall, consumer prices barely move because retailers hold their margins. A 1% increase in producer prices erodes consumer purchasing power by up to 1.24%. Java operates as the core volatility transmitter for the entire country. Long-run conditional correlations of food price volatility hit 0.92 between Java and Sumatra, 0.91 with Kalimantan, and 0.90 with Papua. A harvest failure in Java sends synchronized price spikes across every outer island, even when those islands have completely different local weather. A drought on one end of Java can price food out of reach for communities on the opposite side of the country. In Papua, perishable goods take the worst swings. Cayenne pepper has spiked more than 30% month to month during harvest failures, and shallots and chili have seen seasonal retail increases above 50%. These are not specialty ingredients, they are basics of the Indonesian diet. Public anger over this volatility is measurable. Sentiment analysis heading into 2026 found that 81.4% of reactions to rice price increases were intensely negative, fueled by frustration over quality deterioration, accusations of unequal distribution, and persistent allegations that a rice mafia hoards supply. When adulterated rice, called oplosan, surfaces in traditional markets during shortages, the anxiety across communities deepens fast. The debt trap, from climate shock to generational poverty. Financial damage from a single bad season bleeds forward for years. Researchers have mapped what they call a climate debt doom loop, where climate-driven economic losses pile onto sovereign debt, which then drains the resources available to build future resilience. At the household level, the mechanism is more personal and far more predatory. After a climate shock hits, productive investment drops 12 to 14% for farming families, and as much as 26% for non-agricultural households. Locked out of formal credit, farmers turn to the Ijan system, borrowing emergency cash by selling their future unharvested crops at steeply discounted prices to local moneylenders. Repeated crop failures from back-to-back El Nino droughts or La Niña floods leave these farmers unable to deliver the promised yields. Debt compounds, land rights and productive assets transfer to creditors, and the cycle locks into place across generations. Education collapses in parallel. National surveys show that 20% of rural children who leave school explicitly cite a loss of family income tied to climate-linked crop failures. Senior high school participation in the border region between East Nusa Tenggara and Timor-Leste reaches just 60.42%, which translates to a 39.58% dropout rate, driven by the need to help with household survival during extended droughts. Between 2009 and 2018, climate-related disasters physically damaged or severely disrupted over 50,666 schools. The global picture: 318 million hungry and the system is breaking. Indonesia's story is not an exception. The global agri-food system runs on high optimization and thin margins, and climate variability alone accounts for roughly 1/3 of yield fluctuations worldwide. When breadbasket regions get hit by climate anomalies at the same time, synchronized production can drop up to 10% for maize, 11% for soybean, and 7% for wheat. The probability of a multiple breadbasket failure is climbing at a pace that is not gradual. It is exponential. Modeled risk of simultaneous global maize failure stands at 6% under historical baselines, but that jumps to 54% at 2.0 degrees Celsius of warming. Wheat failure risk rises by 40%. Soybean risk rises by 23%. The places where this is already real, right now, produce numbers that are staggering. Sudan has ongoing famine, with 21.2 million people in crisis or worse. Child malnutrition in Baru hit 52.9%, nearly double the threshold for a formal famine declaration. Across the border of the Horn of Africa, 6.5 million Somalis face IPC Phase 3 or worse, a near doubling from the year before, and the cost of water in the worst-hit areas surged by 2,000%. Severe acute malnutrition is projected to affect 483,000 Somali children, and yet humanitarian food assistance reached only 17% of the population in need. Over in the Caribbean, Hurricane Melissa destroyed more than 16,000 hectares of food crops in Haiti, pushing 5.7 million Haitians into acute food insecurity. Nigeria faces 33.1 million people, projected to experience high levels of hunger by the 2026 lean season, with staple bean prices up 282% year-on-year and local rice up 153%. Global buffers look reassuring on paper, and that is exactly the problem. Total wheat stocks sit at 258.1 million metric tons, but China holds 51.5% of that stockpile and almost never releases it to international markets. Strip China out, and the effective stocks-to-use ratio falls to 19.6%, the lowest since the 2007 to 2008 crisis. Make it worse during every panic. Between 34 and 36 countries imposed unilateral export bans during the 2007 to 2008 food crisis, and econometric analysis shows global prices would have been 13% lower without those restrictions. India banned non-basmati rice exports in July 2023, while controlling 40% of global rice trade, and the FAO Rice Price Index spiked 21.1% year-on-year to a 15-year high. Thai and Vietnamese export quotes shot to their highest levels since 2008 within days. That is the loop. A climate shock cuts supply, governments clamp down on exports, the clampdown tightens global supply even further, prices spiral, and import-dependent nations absorb the hit they can least afford. Economists call the financial side of this the double burden, because dollar-denominated food prices rise at the exact moment that local currencies in developing nations lose value. Wheat prices surged 89% between 2020 and October 2022, and when combined with currency devaluation, actual import cost increases hit between 106 and 176% in countries like Egypt, Pakistan, and Peru. Egypt absorbed $3.048 billion in added costs, equal to 20% of the country's entire food import bill. Globally, the food import bill reached a record $1.94 trillion in 2022, and for developing nations, food imports now eat between 2 and 5% of GDP, consistently outpacing economic growth. World Bank modeling attaches a human number to each tick of the index. Every 1% increase in global food prices forces an estimated 10 million more people into extreme poverty. Fighting back, what actually works? Indonesia's 2026 state budget directs 164.4 trillion rupiah toward food security, with 46.9 trillion rupiah earmarked for subsidizing 9.62 million tons of fertilizer, and 22.7 trillion rupiah for Bulog to manage strategic reserves and stabilize prices. The flagship program is the Free Nutritious Meals Initiative, backed by over 300 trillion rupiah and targeting 82.9 million beneficiaries. Research from China and Japan shows that integrated meal programs boost language scores by 0.223 standard deviations and math scores by 0.172 standard deviations. And mandating local sourcing can lift rural incomes by up to 32.6%, which turns the program into both a nutrition tool and an economic engine. A daily budget of 15,000 rupiah per child, less than $1, limits what ends up on each plate. Coordination spans 19,000 community kitchens, and Indonesia's fiscal deficit is pressing against the statutory ceiling of 3% of GDP. Fitch and S&P have both downgraded the sovereign credit outlook, and interest payments are projected to consume 17% of government revenue. 80,000 red and white village cooperatives have been launched at a cost near $25 billion. The structure looks uncomfortably similar to the Suharto-era village unit cooperatives, which collapsed under mismanagement and corruption. Indonesia's Corruption Perceptions Index sits at 34 out of 100, ranking the country 109th globally. On the global front, anticipatory action, acting before a disaster lands instead of after, delivers the strongest returns. Every dollar spent saves up to $7 in averted losses. The WFP now runs anticipatory programs in 44 countries. Parametric insurance, which triggers automatic payouts when satellite data confirms a drought crossing a preset threshold, is transforming protection for smallholder farmers. Pula Advisors recently executed the largest crop index insurance payout in Zambian history, distributing over 800 million kwacha to more than 500,000 farmers after severe drought. Nature-based approaches carry even higher returns. Combining silvopasture with water management produces a socio-economic return of $14.80 per dollar invested. And here is where it gets worse. Acute food insecurity has tripled since 2016, but humanitarian funding moved in the opposite direction. WFP cut emergency food assistance by 21%, dropping 16.7 million people from life-saving support. The safety net designed to catch everyone else when systems fail is itself failing. Record harvests and record hunger coexist in 2026. The answers are on the table. Nature-based agriculture returns $14.80 per dollar. Anticipatory action returns $7. And parametric insurance can protect millions the instant a satellite confirms a drought. None of those margins hold slack anymore. A delayed rain in the Horn of Africa, a failed sluice gate in Vietnam, a heat wave in Argentina. Each one now carries consequences far beyond its geography. Not because the planet cannot grow enough food, but because the systems built to move it, price it, and protect people from its volatility have fractured. What remains is a question of timing. How fast we act determines whether the next shift in Pacific Ocean temperature becomes a statistic or a catastrophe.